Hey guys, welcome back. We are gonna be watching another video by Chat History today about CIA conspiracies they try to keep hidden. I'm intrigued. What they try to keep hidden.
Secret government conspiracies.
Operation Merlin.
Alright, fellas and fellettes, let's kick this off with something silly. Way back in the late 90s, when my biggest problems were nothing more than navigating the Ocarina of Time water temple and keeping my Neopets from starving, the rest of the world had real problems, like nuclear problems. Big nuclear bomb problems. The biggest players in the nuclear game were Russia and the United States. A small handful of countries had their own too, but they weren't taken too seriously. In order to keep things relatively peaceful, both the US and Russia agreed to minimize their nuclear stockpile and stop irradiating random corners of the globe. Now everyone could sleep soundly knowing that it was far less likely for someone's sweaty little fingy to be hovering over a launch button at any given moment. But what if a less friendly country developed the technology themselves and used it as a last resort to end life as we know it? Your best move would be to proactively prevent that development, or at least severely hinder it. Well, that's exactly what the US tried to do in 1999 when it developed Operation Merlin, a covert CIA operation aimed at sabotaging any possible nuclear weapons development programs in foreign countries, specifically Iran. Why Iran? Simple. They don't like the US and the US doesn't like them. But what do you expect given the fact that the US overthrew the Iranian government in 1953 because of oil? Fast forward to the 90s and trade sanctions and terrorism have caused both countries to put them on edge. But the Iranian government wasn't dumb. They knew full well that a nuclear warhead or 10 would quickly convert their country into a glass parking lot. So in order to level the playing field as well as any opposing military, they would need to develop their own weapons of mass destruction. So whispers of an Iranian nuclear program began to make their way over to the States. No concrete evidence, of course, just a hunch. But just the fear that Iran would develop its very own shiny nukes and gain a seat at the big kids table was enough motivation to intervene. Hey, nice missile. Don't touch. Which brings us back to Operation Merlin. Now the plan here was to have US nuclear warhead blueprints accidentally make their way into the hands of Iranian officials.
So why is it called Merlin? What's the wizardry behind this?
These plans, however, were sabotaged, sprinkled with tidbits of completely wrong information designed to mislead Iranian researchers down a rabbit hole of designing inherently flawed weapons. Imagine you were taking a complicated test. With just 5 minutes left, you realize, oh no, there's a back page. Your blood runs cold as your pupils quiver in fear. Your pores pour profound portions of perspiration from pecs to pelvis. Just then, a soft sound licks your wax-impacted eardrum. Psst, here, your classmate yells. He hands you an answer sheet. You blush blushingly. With this presumably correct information, you manage to finish the test. And then you explode. Alright, that might not be the best analogy, but you get the idea. In order to actually carry out the plan, the CIA needed the delivery boy, which came in the form of a freshly defected Russian nuclear scientist. Plenty of those walking around thanks to the USSR just having recently bath-bombed away. This scientist would be given the flawed blueprints to a TBA 480 high-voltage neutron initiator. Basically, a nuclear bomb's firing pin. The blueprints would be sold to the Iranian government under the guise that they were stolen. But here's the problem. A lot of the details of the operation were on a need-to-know basis. Well, you'd think that the fella actually handling the plans would be given most of that information. He wasn't. In reality, the scientist was only given instruction to sell the plans to Iran, and he didn't know that the designs had been tampered with. So when he went to review the blueprints himself, he noticed some issues. Blueprints wrong. I fix. Yeah, in an innocent act of good faith, the scientists had ironed out the design flaws and proceeded to hand over the now correct blueprints to the Iranian government, unintentionally thwarting the US's whole operation.
You what?
That's right. The American attempt to derail the Iranian nuclear program had completely backfired and may have actually helped their nuclear research in the long run. But it has to be said that Iran is not known to possess any nuclear weapons in the current day, as far as we know. The only reason we know about Operation Merlin is thanks to former CIA officer Jeffrey Sterling, who leaked information about the mission to a New York Times journalist in 2003. He got a 3.5-year prison sentence for that little stunt.
Operation Mockingbird.
Operation Mockingbird should be no surprise to anyone, especially nowadays. A couple of years after the end of the critically acclaimed sequel to World War I, previously alive President Harry Truman established the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, for the sake of upholding American national security. And by national security, this meant just shooting ropes of American influence across the globe to protect American interests. Interests that would soon be threatened by the Soviet Union. Having just fought side by side as allies in World War II, both the US and the USSR quickly turned on each other thanks to ideological differences, thus kickstarting the Cold War. The USSR scrambled to establish a geopolitical foothold in now German unoccupied territories across Eastern Europe. You are German now. Okay. Now you Soviet. Alright. Not only did this grant the USSR expanded access to natural resources, but it also provided a sort of Ferris sheet, if you will, of communist countries around the motherland's Western Front. The United States, having just witnessed the abhorrent conditions under Stalin's totalitarian control, was all absolutely not, and sought to prevent any of that smelly communist influence from leaking across the rest of Europe. Alright, which one looks better? No, come on, Poland. Focus. But the very last thing the US needed was to have communistic influence take root and grow from within. So in order to stamp out that possibility, the US government needed to remind Americans just how good they had it. Capitalism good, communism bad. Enter Operation Mockingbird, a covert CIA operation designed with the goal of steering public opinion away from any communist influence. But a direct in-your-face approach wouldn't do the trick. This needed to be more subtle and appear to be coming from multiple trusted sources. The more widespread the idea, the easier it is to believe. Now you have to admit, the general population is easily swayed. That's why political campaigns work. But back in the 1950s or so, access to information was nowhere near what it is today. So many messages were taken at face value by the vast majority of Americans. If you heard from your favorite news sources that millions had died under Stalin's communist...
Those works of art are great. Like, not in the message, but the way they are portrayed.
...regime and that communism was spreading to the US, you're gonna shit a brick. If your favorite movies portrayed communists as evil little minions who want to steal your freedoms, you're gonna be one pissed off Polly. The only good commie is one that ain't alive no more. I'll work on that later. There's probably no better way to control the masses than by fear and anger. Under Operation Mockingbird, the CIA had infiltrated the majority of the US's main media outlets, including news broadcast stations, journals, magazines, newspapers, movies, and radio, planting anti-communist propaganda and focusing the narrative on good old American values. The CIA had hundreds of members of the press, including many higher-up publishers and editors from across the nation, secretly on the government payroll from the 1950s to the 1970s. These reporters and journalists would discreetly gather information about public opinion and disseminate CIA-authored pro-American, anti-Soviet stories, even if they were a bit over-exaggerated. It was essentially the country's first wide-scale fake news factory. If you read any kind of news article in the time, chances are it was written, or at least heavily edited, by the CIA.
You are fake news.
The anti-communist propaganda had caused mass hysteria across the US, resulting in incidents like the Red Scare, which had Americans pitted against each other. You just never knew if your friendly, well-groomed, handsome neighbor was secretly a communist sympathizer. Oh, hey, Todd. Yeah, I'm just watering my flowers, making sure they're all getting watered equally. I bet they'd probably water themselves if I gave them the hose. By the 1970s, Americans started to actually think a bit for themselves. With recent disasters like the Vietnam War and Nixon's Watergate scandal, government trust was in a bear market, and the public was buying puts. As an execution of checks and balances, the US Senate had unanimously approved the formation of the Church Committee in 1975. This committee, which consisted of 11 politicians and lawyers, was tasked with exposing the many suspected abuses of the CIA. And with their research, they blew the whistle on many of the CIA's horrid atrocities, bringing them right into the public spotlight. These included the notorious Project MKUltra, various assassination attempts on foreign leaders, attempts at overthrowing foreign governments, and of course, Operation Mockingbird. So, what do you have to say to accusations of
Wait, MKUltra? That's kind of outlaws, isn't it?
CIA propaganda? I'd say that you could take a propaganda at my asshole, Senator. After the jig was up, the CIA claimed that all
they actually
operations
say
had
that?
ceased on the Mockingbird front, but of course, we know that that's not true. Nowadays, every one of us has access to more information than we could possibly process in a lifetime. Each article, video, post, blog,
Or we have too much
algorithm,
information.
just a potential gateway to subliminal messaging and swaying our decisions. Operation Northwoods is one of those things where you'd ask yourself, the US government wouldn't really do that, would they? Yes. Yes, they would. Back in 1959, communism had hit too close to home for the United States. Just outside the Gulf of whatever this is now, trouble was a-brewing in Cuba. That would be the Cuban Revolution, headed by this scraggly little scoundrel. Having just overthrown a corrupt, fascist, and US-approved government rife with economic inequality, Castro sought to even the odds for his fellow Cubans moving forward. His answer? Communism. Specifically the Marxist-Leninist flavor. But no matter the type of communism, the US wasn't too keen on having a communist nation a stone's throw away from the tip of its dongle. It also didn't help that Castro had seized control of all American businesses in Cuba, including sugar and coffee plantations and oil refineries. In response, five-star General President Eisenhower had slammed the communist government with strict restrictions on trade and vowed to cast Castro aside. But that was another president's job. In 1961, shiny new President John F. Kennedy had attempted to huck Castro out of Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion. A group of about 1,500 anti-Castro Cuban revolutionaries were taken in, trained, and had millions of American dollars worth of military equipment thrown at them. Here, go kill Castro. And so they tried. The Bay of Pigs invasion, though, was an embarrassing failure. The Cuban military, over 200,000 strong, completely decimated the paltry invading force in just a few days. Now, having just warded off what he knew was essentially a US invasion, Castro felt a bit big in his britches. The US needed a better plan, but they were limited with what they could actually do. Since Cuba was buddy-buddy with the big communist motherland, a direct invasion by the US would almost certainly mean a Soviet invasion in Europe, so President Kennedy needed to really use his head for this one. But it was actually his brother that authored a solution. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy developed Operation Mongoose, a covert CIA operation designed to take down Castro's Cuba from the inside. CIA-funded Cubans would be recruited in Miami and dumped in Cuba to form a revolutionary militia. The US would influence political support for the would-be revolutionaries, which would lead to an eventual coup and usurp Castro, giving the US the chance to shape the government however they wanted. But a key part of that plan was to convince other nations that Cuba was wild, irrational, and dangerous, to the point of supporting US intervention. This is where Operation Northwoods comes in, a proposed CIA covert false flag operation aimed at executing domestic and foreign acts of terror against innocent civilians in order to justify aggressive US military action against Cuba. Some of the proposed terrorist acts included destroying a US ship and conducting fake funerals, attacking Cuban refugees seeking haven in Miami, planting plastic bombs in strategic locations in Miami, destroying Dominican Republic crops and planting false evidence, and staging attacks on US aircraft. And the list goes on. But the most damning evidence comes straight from the source. Here's an excerpt from the declassified Operation Northwoods document, highlighting a plan to fake a plane hijacking. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft. The duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. The document goes on to explain how both planes would follow the same flight path, with the duplicate passenger-carrying craft secretly landing and safely evacuating all passengers. This plane would then be reverted back to its original appearance. The original empty plane would then continue its flight path over Cuba. Once in Cuban airspace, fake pilot radio transmissions would play, declaring that the plane was under attack by Cuban aircraft. The transmission would then be cut off by the plane's remote detonation, simulating its destruction by Cuban forces. The culmination of these events would undoubtedly rally Americans against the Cuban government, justifying and essentially greenlighting an American invasion. But then a little thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. Turns out that the Soviet Union had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is hilarious, because the United States secretly installed nuclear missiles in Turkey. This was the closest the world ever came to an actual nuclear apocalypse. In order to avoid mutual destruction, the Soviets agreed to dismantle their nukes under the condition that the US dismantled their own nukes and cease all military aggression against Cuba. And with that agreement, Operation Mongoose was terminated and Operation Northwoods was shelved, hopefully never inspiring any future events.
Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip. Even if you're not a history junkie, you've probably heard of this. This is where US government ethics completely disintegrated like a big green fart in the wind. The Second World War wasn't one of just military strength, but of cunning, intelligence, and ingenuity as well. Emerging technologies gave each side advantages on the war front. The UK with its code-breaking Colossus computer, Germany with its devastating V2 rocket technology, and of course the US with its catastrophic atomic bombs. Nazi Germany had some of the greatest scientific minds of the modern age. It's an indisputable fact. And after Germany's surrender, the US wanted to leverage that expertise for its own technological advancements. Of course, there was also a concern that the Soviets would attempt the same thing, so it became a matter of national security. Well, the Soviets did end up yoinking over 2,500 scientists and various equipment for themselves under Operation Oswiecim, but no one ever really talks about that. In July of 1945, a mere 2 months after the Main Mustache himself downed a pill and a bullet, Operation Overcast, later renamed Operation Paperclip, had commenced. An operation designed to scoop up Nazi scientists from Germany, seize their research and technologies, and grant them asylum in the US so they can help develop weapons against Japan, who was still very much determined to win the Pacific Theater. Something they'll retrospectively regret in about a month. Most of the scientists recruited were experts in the fields of rocket science, aviation, and chemical and biological warfare. Over 1,600 Nazi scientists were recruited into the American scientific community and given research jobs.
Since I mentioned Outlast before, this is also an Outlast.
Be a hell of a resume. Okay, looks like it says here you held a position for a bit in Auschwitz. Hope I'm saying that right. As a camp counselor. Why don't you tell me more about that? No, that's okay. Operation Paperclip had absorbed some of the most prominent figures of the German scientific community. For example, you had Hubertus Struckhold, an aeronautical medical researcher. He was recruited into NASA and went on to design critical astronaut protective equipment for various spaceflight missions. During World War II, however, he was complicit in several human experiments at the Dachau concentration camp. There was also Heinz Haber, an aeronautical physicist that also participated in human experimentation efforts to further his research. Haber eventually became the chief scientific consultant for the Walt Disney Company in the 1950s. And of course, there was former SS officer Werner von Braun, Germany's leading rocket technology engineer who helped design the V2 rocket through brutal slave labor. He became a NASA director and one of the most prominent figures in the American space frontier. He also worked with the Walt Disney Company to popularize the subject of human space travel. With American scientists now welcoming their new, funny-talking coworkers of questionable origin, the US had some cleaning up to do. See, the American public had zero knowledge of Operation Paperclip's existence, so it was up to the government to rebrand these Nazis as good old wholesome geniuses who all coincidentally wave at a 45-degree angle. Histories were hidden and war crimes were scrubbed for the sake of technological progress. And boy oh boy was there progress. With the help from the Germans, the US made unprecedented breakthroughs in aeronautical technology, largely contributing to the US's success in the space race against the Soviet Union with the Apollo missions. Over the following decades, however, many of Operation Paperclip's beneficiaries found themselves in the crosshairs of American journalists. Previously buried pasts were soon dug up, and links to war crimes were being reconnected. Fearing persecution and eventual prosecution, many of the scientists got the hell out of the US to seek refuge elsewhere. Although rumors of Paperclip circulated as early as 1946, the official documents were formally declassified under President Clinton's Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998. Pretty messed up, right? Think about it, if you think these conspiracies are bad, just imagine the ones that haven't been declassified. If you want me to dive into more conspiracies in another video, let me know with a comment. Anyway, if your sick mind is disappointed that Project MKUltra didn't make the list, don't worry. It's because I covered it in my third Evil Human Experiments video, which you can watch here. You can also check out my other.
Yeah, that's probably also an interesting one. You are probably gonna watch that at some point. Alright, but that's it for now. Take care, guys. Bye-bye. Thank you so much, guys, for watching the video. I hope you liked it. If you did, please leave a like, go subscribe, and follow my Twitch for even more content. See you next time. Bye-bye.